Purely objective behavioral psychology often reaches its limit during periods of acute social upheaval. Mapping external actions alone cannot explain how an individual navigates the collapse of a long-standing ideological system. This inadequacy suggests the need for an ethical psychology of personality. This framework treats good and evil not as abstract cultural artifacts, but as active internal determinants that drive a subject's development. To understand how humans maintain integrity under pressure, we must look past surface actions and model the internal architecture of their moral processing. Researchers at Kazan Federal University tested this internal processing by asking students to categorize personality traits and societal concepts into binary columns, good and evil. This visualization represents the initial uniform results. Abstract virtues like mercy and honesty were placed in the good column, while vices like greed and cruelty went to evil. Students similarly sorted concepts like democracy as positive and prison as negative. However, when the study introduced specific historical figures from periods of social transition, the students' categorization system broke down. Names began appearing in both columns at once. Peter the Great sat simultaneously in the good and evil columns for many participants. Tsar Nicholas II created the same duplicate placement. Vladimir Lenin also fractured the binary, occupying both moral spaces depending on the student's perspective. Modern transitional politicians like Vladimir Zhirinovsky triggered the same overlapping assessments. Viktor Chernomyrdin similarly defied a single moral label. When these figures were forced into a simple binary, the students were torn by contradictory motives. This local failure to categorize suggests that without a structural framework for processing ambiguity, the mind's rigid moral binaries simply collapse when confronted with the complexity of real-world history. To move beyond binary sorting, we can build a unified model of the developing subject across three philosophical coordinates: the actual, the ought, and the possible. The actual describes the subject's current psychological state, the real-world cognitive processes and mental products they already have in place. The ought represents a dual processing target. It encompasses both intellectual benchmarks, like solving a specific problem, and moral ethical ideals, representing the standard the subject aims to reach. The possible is the vector field connecting them. It maps the zone of developmental potential, the specific pathway required to move from current reality to the ideal. In this model, psychological development is the transition from the actual to the possible, driven by the persistent pull of the ought. To understand what moves a subject along that path, we look to the determinant complex. This begins with external determination, the inputs from nature, technology, and the social environment. These external historical and cultural inputs are never processed raw. They are always filtered through the internal determination engine. One half of this core is the motivational personal polysphere. This is where a subject's values, ethical layer, and willpower modify how they perceive external events. The other half is the I polysphere, representing the subject's self-concept and internal identity architecture. By filtering reality through these internal motivational and identity layers, the subject reshapes every external dilemma into an internal problem before any action is taken. Building on these static structures, we can now see the mechanical process of how a subject handles a moral or cognitive problem over time. S. L. Rubinstein's theory maps the conscious, logical track. It moves from a problem to a hypothesis, then through specific tasks to a final conclusion. Layered beneath this is Y. A. Ponomarev's track for unconscious, intuitive processing. It tracks a problem to a collapse of logic, an intuitive flash, and finally, verbalization. The system operates through a psychological pendulum, oscillating vertically between conscious logic and unconscious intuition as the subject moves horizontally through the problem's timeline. As the pendulum's vertical arc widens, it passes through 4 distinct levels, marking the expansion of the subject's cognitive territory from simple reproduction to complex creation. To reach the intuitive flash, the pendulum must pass through a critical bottleneck, the collapse of logical programs. This is a mandatory state where old rules are discarded to make room for a new insight. This suggests that cognitive and moral growth requires the collapse of existing logical frameworks, forcing the unconscious system to synthesize a more complex ethical reality. Within this structural architecture, we can see the specific engines driving the subject's trajectory: spirituality and conscience. Spirituality is often treated as an inherently positive or light-oriented force. But in this model, dark spirituality is just as structured as its positive counterpart. It is built through progressive stages, where a deliberate choice to ignore conscience crystallizes into a rigid, habitual orientation toward vice. Because both good and evil are built on this same internal architecture, they require the same level of psychological complexity and spiritual depth to sustain. Erich Fromm's research on conscience clarifies how the subject's ought target determines the health of the entire system. In an authoritarian conscience, the ought target remains outside the subject's core, operating through fear of an external authority. In a humanistic conscience, that target is integrated internally. The subject acts for their own integrity, driving a blue feedback loop of self-actualization. In this model of ethical psychology, moral choices are not just cultural overlays. They function as internal structural coordinates, setting the boundaries for how a human being can cognitively and behaviorally evolve.